They tried to silence him with bullets. They tried to drown his voice beneath the weight of power. But instead the world heard something new, a defiance, a heartbeat, a rising flame. In the heart of West Africa, in a landlocked nation that many once called weak, a young captain stood before his people and declared a different path. His name, Ibrahim Traoré. His nation, Burkina Faso. His promise that no foreign chain would dictate the destiny of his soil. It was not charity he sought, nor pity. It was dignity. And in that moment, the air itself seemed to shift. Because what happens when a man barely past 30 challenges empires older than his nation? What happens when a country written off as small dares to stand tall? Stay with us. This is more than a headline. It is a turning point that history will remember. Subscribe and keep walking this road with us. Burkina Faso, once dismissed as a pawn on the chessboard of global powers, has become a symbol, a question mark, a spark. And as the world watches, we must ask, is this the birth of a new era for Africa or the beginning of another storm? It began with whispers in the barracks, shadows moving quietly in the corridors of power. The people of Burkina Faso had grown weary of broken promises, of leaders who spoke of sovereignty but knelt for aid, of the endless violence that stained their soil red. And then, in the autumn of 2022, a name burst forth like thunder: Ibrahim Traoré. At just 34, he was younger than many of the men he commanded, but he carried the fire of a generation that refused to inherit chains. The coup was swift, shocking the international community, but to many Burkinabé, it felt like a release, as if an old weight had finally been lifted. Crowds poured into the streets, waving flags not out of fear, but out of pride. For once, chants of defiance drowned out the silence of resignation. Yet the path of sovereignty is never straight. Soon after consolidating power, Traoré would face not only insurgencies on the ground, but also threats aimed directly at his life. Reports of an assassination attempt spread like wildfire, leaving a nation on edge. The details remain contested. Who pulled the strings? Who held the weapon? Who whispered in the dark? What is clear is this: forces within and beyond Burkina Faso did not want his vision to survive. Imagine a hall filled with tension, the sound of boots echoing against concrete, the eyes of loyalists scanning the shadows. In moments like these, leadership is not an office, not a title. It is a test. Traoré himself would later tell his people that he stood ready to give his life if that was the price of freedom. To many, those words were not rhetoric. They were the heartbeat of a revolution in motion. The timeline of those turbulent months was a storm. First, the fall of Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba, the previous leader ousted for failing to curb jihadist violence. Then, the young captain's sudden rise. Then, gunfire in the capital, Ouagadougou, as factions tested loyalties. For ordinary families, this was not theater. It was survival. Mothers rushed their children indoors. Traders shuttered their stalls. Soldiers blocked roads with armored vehicles. And yet beneath the fear, a strange current of hope surged. For decades, Burkina Faso had been branded poor, fragile, aid-dependent. But in those days, many began to believe that dignity could be worth more than dollars, that self-determination was worth more than stability imposed from abroad. It was as if a long-buried seed had cracked open beneath the soil, fragile yet alive, pushing toward the light. The numbers were stark: thousands displaced by insurgent attacks, hundreds of villages scarred, more than 2 million living in uncertainty. But beyond the statistics lay a question larger than any report could contain. Would Burkina Faso remain a pawn, or would it carve its own path? Traoré framed his rise not as ambition but as duty. He spoke of ancestors who tilled the land with calloused hands, of rivers that still ran red from the sacrifices of the past. He insisted that sovereignty was not a slogan, but survival. His words cut through the noise of politics. If we must fall, we fall standing. To his supporters, those words became a shield. They repeated them in markets, in schools, even in refugee camps where families clung to scraps of normal life. To his critics, they were dangerous, an invitation to chaos in a region already burning. But either way, they were unforgettable. For the youth especially, his rise carried a symbolism larger than any speech. Here was a man barely older than themselves, defying presidents, generals, and foreign diplomats who had long dictated the pace of African politics. If he could stand tall in the face of such storms, perhaps they too could believe in a different tomorrow. And so the nation stood at a crossroads. One road paved with fear, dependency, and the comfort of foreign aid. The other filled with risk, sacrifice, and the fragile dream of true independence. To walk the second road was to challenge powers far greater than Ouagadougou, To refuse was to remain in the cycle of poverty and obedience. In those early days, Traore chose the second road, and by doing so he forced every Burkinabe to ask, were they willing to pay the price of sovereignty? Could a landlocked nation of barely 20 million hold its ground against the weight of global empires? And as he stood before the crowd in Ouagadougou, his beret tilted, his voice rising above the chants, many felt that something irreversible had begun. Whether one called it rebellion, coup, or rebirth, the message was the same. Burkina Faso would no longer bow. But every spark risks becoming a wildfire, and every wildfire attracts storms. What came next would test not only a young captain, but the very soul of a nation. The coup was only the beginning. The true test came when the dust settled, when the chance of victory faded into the heavy silence of reality. For Ibrahim Traoré, the young captain who had risen like a flame, the days after seizing power were the crucible in which his resolve would either shatter or be forged into steel. The capital, Ouagadougou, pulsed with uncertainty. Rumors spread faster than the Harmattan winds. Some whispered that mercenaries lurked in the shadows. Others claimed that foreign embassies plotted his downfall. Soldiers loyal to the old guard still lingered in hidden corners, their silence more dangerous than their weapons. And then came the reports, an assassination attempt. Shots fired in the night. Traoré's convoy allegedly ambushed on a dusty road. Was it fact or fabrication? No one could say with certainty. But the fear was real, the tension palpable. In those days, the streets of the city were transformed into a stage of both courage and dread. Supporters flooded the squares, chanting his name, holding placards with slogans of sovereignty and independence. They believed that if Traoré fell, the dream of a free Burkina Faso would fall with him. Mothers carried their children on their backs into the crowds, not out of recklessness, but out of defiance, as if to say, our future will not be stolen again. The army itself was a theater of loyalty and betrayal. In the barracks, officers measured their choices carefully, stand with the young captain and risk international condemnation, or hesitate and be swept aside by the tide of change. Each passing hour deepened the tension. Gunfire cracked in the distance. Columns of smoke rose above neighborhoods. The air smelled of both gunpowder and fear. And yet, amid the crackling of rifles and the whispers of betrayal, there was a counterpoint, the pounding rhythm of voices in unison. When Traoré emerged before the crowd, beret tilted, uniform creased but proud, his words carried a weight that exceeded his age. He told them that no bullet, no plot, no betrayal would deter him from the mission of sovereignty. He admitted openly that leadership meant being ready to die for the soil that birthed you. The crowd erupted, not in fear but in thunderous affirmation. In that moment, he ceased being only a soldier. He became a symbol. The reaction spread across the layers of society. Intellectuals in Ouagadougou universities debated whether the revolution could last. Priests and imams spoke from pulpits and mosques, invoking prayers for protection but also urging restraint. Market women, whose livelihoods depended on stability, declared that they preferred hunger with dignity over bread with chains. For them, the coup was not a headline, it was a gamble with their daily lives. International media descended quickly, cameras capturing the turbulence with dramatic headlines. Burkina Faso in turmoil, young soldier defies the odds, uncertainty looms in West Africa. Western commentators painted Traoré as reckless, an inexperienced officer throwing his people into chaos. Yet local outlets told another story, of a leader who dared to say no, of a generation unwilling to kneel again. Meanwhile, across West Africa, governments watched nervously. In Accra, in Abidjan, in Dakar, presidents whispered about the Burkina question. Would this defiance spark imitators? Would their own soldiers begin to see possibility in the example of a captain who toppled a regime? In ECOWAS meetings, phrases like threat to stability and constitutional order were repeated endlessly. Yet in the streets of Ouagadougou, banners proclaimed words older and deeper: sovereignty, dignity, freedom. On social media, the storm only grew louder. Hashtags surged, memes appeared, revolutionary songs remixed with Traoré's name went viral. Youth across Africa shared his image, not as propaganda, but as aspiration. They saw in his eyes the reflection of their own frustrations, corruption, dependency, leaders who clung to thrones while their people starved. The climax of this chapter was not a single explosion or gunfight, but a collective moment, an entire nation holding its breath. Would the young leader survive the storm gathering around him? Would the bullet find its mark, or would history? Because history was watching. From the Sahel's dusty plains to the skyscrapers of New York, from Brussels conference rooms to village squares in Mali, eyes turned to Burkina Faso. In the clash of headlines and hashtags, in the fear of neighbors and the faith of his people, Traoré's survival became more than a personal matter. It was a test of whether the seed of sovereignty planted in blood and fire could take root in hostile soil. And as the storm raged, one truth became clear. This was no longer just about one man. It was about whether an entire nation could withstand the weight of history pressing down upon it. But what would happen when the guns fell silent? That was a question no one could yet answer. The smoke of the coup had barely cleared when the deeper consequences began to surface. For the people of Burkina Faso, the shift of power was not only about politics, it was about survival. In the markets of Ouagadougou, women spoke of prices rising and supply chains faltering. In the north, where jihadist attacks had forced thousands to flee, displacement camps swelled beyond capacity. Every family carried the weight of uncertainty. Every conversation whispered the same question. Had the sacrifice opened a door to freedom, or simply another chapter of hardship? The immediate civil impact was stark. Schools closed in conflict zones, leaving children without classrooms, their laughter replaced by silence. Farmers hesitated to plant in regions plagued by violence, afraid that their harvest would be seized by militants. Traders, once the lifeblood of the city, saw their goods stranded on blocked roads. The sense of instability touched not only the poor, but the middle classes too. Civil servants wondered if salaries would arrive. Shopkeepers feared that customers would vanish. And yet amid the hardship, there was also resilience. Families gathered around radios at night, listening to the government's proclamations, hearing the new leader insist that sovereignty was the only path forward. For many, the Ibrahim Traoré speech delivered after the attempted assassination became a turning point. His words, mixing defiance and compassion, gave people the sense that dignity was not a distant dream, but a living choice. "We cannot build our children's future with borrowed hands," he declared. "We must stand with our own." That refrain echoed through homes and marketplaces, repeated by ordinary citizens as if it were scripture. Politically, the coup reset the chessboard. Former allies of the ousted regime fled or repositioned themselves. Some sought asylum abroad, others attempted to blend into the new order, pledging loyalty to Traoré's vision. Within the military, allegiances were tested daily. Officers who once enjoyed patronage were stripped of influence, while younger commanders, many closer in age to the captain himself, rose rapidly. The structure of power in Ouagadougou became more volatile but also more dynamic. Civil society felt the weight of the transition. Journalists walked a fine line. To criticize too openly risked being seen as undermining the revolution, yet to remain silent was to betray their role as truth-tellers. Religious leaders spoke of peace, but their sermons often carried hidden messages of warning. A leader must be careful not only of enemies beyond his walls, but of shadows at his table. Students and youth groups, meanwhile, seized the moment. They organized rallies, forums, and debates, proclaiming that if Burkina Faso was to become truly sovereign, the voices of its young must not be silenced. The humanitarian situation grew more complex. International NGOs weighed their options. Should they continue to provide aid in partnership with a government that openly defied Western influence? Or should they withdraw, leaving vulnerable communities without support? In rural clinics, doctors struggled with shortages, while in urban hospitals, the influx of wounded from clashes strained already fragile systems. The political drama of Ouagadougou was felt in the most intimate of places: the cradle of a newborn, the grave of a fallen soldier, the empty plate on a family table. And yet, even in this crucible, a sense of pride took root. For decades, Burkina Faso had been cast as dependent, weak, always waiting for solutions from abroad. But now, in conversations across cafes, in letters published in local papers, in debates at universities, a different tone emerged. People began to speak of dignity as if it were more essential than bread. They repeated Traoré's defiance as their own. For some, this meant enduring greater hardship without complaint. For others, it meant demanding accountability from the new government. If you promise sovereignty, you must show us sovereignty in action. The political ripple reached beyond borders. In Mali and Niger, neighbors facing similar struggles, citizens pointed to Burkina Faso as a mirror of their own frustrations. Could they too reject the cycle of aid and dependence? Could they too believe that sovereignty was possible? In this way, the impact of the coup extended far beyond Burkina Faso's borders, raising the stakes for the entire Sahel region. But at home, contradictions remained sharp. The economy teetered, security was fragile, and the cost of rebellion weighed heavily on civilians. The nation was both proud and wounded, both hopeful and exhausted. It was a paradox that could not be sustained forever. And so, as families lit fires under night skies, as children recited lessons from memory because schools lay empty, as farmers pressed seeds into uncertain soil, the future hung in the balance. Would the sacrifice of the present become the foundation of a sovereign tomorrow, or would the cracks of instability swallow the dream? When the dust of the coup settled over Ouagadougou, it did not remain confined within Burkina Faso's borders. The world was watching, and the ripples reached far beyond the Sahel. In Brussels, Washington, Paris, Abuja, conference rooms lit up with urgent debates. For some, the events were alarming. For others, they were a signal that the global balance of power in Africa was beginning to shift. Regional organizations moved first. ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, issued stern statements demanding a return to constitutional order. They threatened sanctions, travel bans, and suspensions, hoping to pressure the young leader into compliance. But for many Burkinabe, these words rang hollow. They asked, where were these guardians of democracy when villages burned? Where were their condemnations when children starved? To them, the outrage felt selective, even hypocritical. The African Union expressed concern but adopted a more cautious tone, aware that the tide of coup across the Sahel, from Mali to Guinea to Niger, signaled deeper discontent that could not be silenced by resolutions alone. In quiet corridors, diplomats admitted that a generation of Africans was demanding sovereignty, not slogans. From Europe, the reaction was sharper. France, long the former colonial power in Burkina Faso, saw its influence slipping. Commentators in Paris described Traoré as a dangerous populist, a man courting chaos. Yet in the streets of Ouagadougou, the narrative was reversed. Crowds marched against French military presence, demanding the withdrawal of troops and bases. The very symbols of France's reach, flags, embassies, convoys, became lightning rods for public anger. Across the Atlantic, the United States adopted the language of stability. Officials spoke of grave concern, of threats to counterterrorism cooperation, of risks to democratic norms. But behind the cautious phrases lay a deeper worry. If Burkina Faso charted an independent course, would other African nations follow?
The true war,
would the dominoes fall,
deserts,
reshaping the map of
the
alliances in West Africa? Meanwhile, Russia and other emerging players saw opportunity. Russian state media praised the uprising as a blow to Western dominance, portraying Traoré as a young lion of African resistance. Conversations about security partnerships with Moscow grew louder, especially as neighboring Mali deepened its ties with the Wagner Group. The Burkina Faso coup thus became more than a domestic matter. It was a node in the great geopolitical contest of the 21st century. Ordinary Africans across the continent absorbed these narratives with keen interest. In Bamako, Niamey, Conakry, students debated whether the Sahel was experiencing not chaos but rebirth. On social media, memes cast Traoré as a symbol of youth-led defiance. For them, Burkina Faso was not a cautionary tale. It was a mirror of their own hunger for change. But while the world projected its fears and hopes onto the young captain, the people of Burkina Faso lived the consequences daily. For them, the question was not ideology nor geopolitics, but whether their sovereignty would bring security, food, and dignity. And as the headlines multiplied, one truth emerged. The eyes of the world could not decide the fate of Burkina Faso. Only its people could. But would the world allow them that choice? The story of Burkina Faso stands at a crossroads. The coup, the speeches, the defiance, they are not an ending, but a beginning. For Ibrahim Traoré and his people, the path forward is not paved with certainty. It is a road cut into rough stone, a journey where every step demands sacrifice. The challenges are immense. The jihadist threat remains real, haunting villages in the north and east. Economic pressures weigh heavily on families who already endure scarcity. Diplomatic isolation threatens access to markets and investment. Even within the military, unity is fragile, tested by ambition and suspicion. These are storms that could easily overwhelm a young leader and a fragile nation. And yet within the storm lies possibility. For the first time in decades, the language of dignity has entered daily life. Market vendors speak of sovereignty as naturally as they do of grain and salt. Teachers tell students that independence is not only a date in history, but a duty to live. Farmers, pressing seeds into soil, remind their children that freedom is like a crop. It requires labor, patience, and resilience. If Burkina Faso can endure the present hardship, it may chart a path unseen in modern times. An Africa where aid is replaced by trade, where pity is replaced by partnership, where dignity is not a slogan, but a currency. But endurance alone is not enough. The new leadership must translate passion into policy, slogans into systems. Roads must be built, schools reopened, trust rebuilt between citizens and state. Sovereignty cannot only be shouted, it must be lived. On the regional stage, the choices will be defining. Will Burkina Faso deepen alliances with neighbors who share its defiance, building a Sahelian bloc that rejects external domination? Or will it risk isolation, cut off from both aid and allies? On the global stage, will it seek new partners in a shifting world order, balancing East and West? Or will it be drawn into new dependencies wearing different masks? The road is narrow, and the price will be high. But history teaches that no empire lasts forever, and no chain is unbreakable. If one small landlocked nation can carve a new path, the question is not whether it is possible, but whether others will follow. And so the people of Burkina Faso walk forward, not with certainty, but with resolve. Their future is not guaranteed, but neither is their defeat. What matters is whether the soil of sacrifice will bear fruit, whether the spark of defiance will ignite a harvest of freedom. Because the journey ahead is not only about Burkina Faso, it is about Africa. And the question hangs in the air. If one nation dares to stand, what stops the rest? The journey of Burkina Faso is not the tale of one man, nor the fleeting drama of a single year. It is the story of a people who refused to bow, who chose dignity over dependence, who turned hardship into defiance. The name of Ibrahim Traoré will echo not only for his bold actions, but for what his courage represents. The awakening of a nation long written off as powerless. In a world where empires rise and fall, where foreign powers measure nations in terms of resources and alliances, the people of Burkina Faso chose to measure themselves by something greater: sovereignty. They declared that their soil, their children, their future were not commodities to be traded. They reminded the world that true strength is not in how much aid you receive, but in how much freedom you defend. The Ibrahim Traoré speech that followed the attempted assassination was more than words. It was a declaration that love of country can outlive bullets. It was a promise that dignity, once awakened, cannot be silenced. That speech will be remembered not only in Ouagadougou, but across Africa, where young people search for leaders who dare to speak with honesty and courage. Yes, the Burkina Faso coup shook the world, but what matters is what follows. Will the country stumble into the old cycle of dependency and division? Or will it rise, scarred but stronger, a beacon for others who long to reclaim their voice? The choice rests not in foreign capitals, nor in conference halls, but in the hands of its people. Across villages, classrooms, and markets, that choice is already being made. It is seen in the resilience of mothers who refuse to surrender their children's dreams, in the determination of farmers who still plant seeds in uncertain soil, in the fire of students who chant for freedom with voices too strong to ignore. And so we return to the question that opened this journey. If one small nation can stand, what stops the rest? The world may doubt, empires may sneer, but the truth remains. Chains break, crowns rust, but dignity endures. If this story stirs your sense of justice, stay with us. Share, comment, and subscribe. Because history is not only written in books, it is written by those who refuse to kneel. And the Ibrahim Traoré speech is not the end. It is the beginning of a chapter Africa has long awaited.